Today, we're tackling a situation many families find themselves in when spending just feels like it's completely gotten away from you.
Mm-hmm.
We've looked into a conversation where a family was seeking some professional financial advice.
Right.
And our mission today is really to pull out the essentials, the key steps, the vital vocabulary, and the core ideas you need to start understanding. And maybe more importantly, reining in spending that feels out of control.
Exactly. We're going to dive into the practical steps and the language around them using this specific family scenario as our guide.
Okay, great. So let's start with the family we looked at, Mr. and Mrs. Carnwell. What was their situation exactly?
Well, the Carnwells, they kind of present a common paradox. They actually have what most people would call a pretty high household income.
Right.
And before recently, money wasn't really a big stressor for them.
Okay, so we're not necessarily talking about a low-income problem here. They make good money, but something shifted?
Precisely, yeah. Despite having that strong income, their spending had, and this is their word, it had absolutely skyrocketed.
Skyrocketed.
And it just felt completely out of control.
Skyrocketed, like going up really high, really fast, like we saw with, gas prices a while back.
Exactly like that. From maybe $1 to $4 almost overnight.
Yeah.
And out of control, kind of like an unruly toddler maybe. Screaming and hitting, just no management.
Yeah, a lack of order applied to their finances.
Exactly. And there were several things feeding into it. They have 2 kids, they give them allowances, and maybe significantly, they were actually paying off their kids' credit card bills.
Oof. Yeah, kids with credit cards, they can't manage themselves. That's often a sign things are already a bit loose, financially speaking.
Definitely. And then you add their existing big expenses, like a mortgage, car payments, and the real trigger, the thing that made them seek help, was a recent economic downturn, which hit the husband's business. So their income suddenly became less certain.
Gotcha. So the reliable flow of money, it hit a bump, and that suddenly revealed just how much their spending had, ballooned.
That's it.
Okay, so this is where the financial advisor comes in. Now, they didn't just jump straight to telling them what to cut, did they? There was a really crucial first step.
No, absolutely not. The foundational first step, the one the advisor really insisted on, was determining their cash flow.
Cash flow. And that's basically just money coming in versus money going out. Is it that simple?
At its core, yes. But actually determining it means figuring out exactly how much is coming into the household and exactly how much is leaving.
Right.
And this step is critical because, look, you just cannot make any kind of plan. You can't allocate your money sensibly until you know how much you actually have to work with after, the essential stuff is paid.
Right. So before you even think about canceling Netflix or packing lunches, you absolutely have to get the hard numbers. Money in, money out.
Yeah.
Okay. Determine cash flow. What's next?
So once they had a handle on their cash flow, the next step was kind of like detective work, gathering 2 to 3 months of receipts for everything. This is the point where they figure out their average expenditures and identify exactly where the money has actually been going.
Expenditures.
Yeah.
Right. It's just a slightly more formal word for expenses.
Yeah.
The things you spend money on.
Exactly that. Car payments, rent, groceries, healthcare, sure, but also, eating out, shopping, entertainment.
Yeah.
All of it. And looking at these expenditures helps you see the patterns. And as they looked, the advisor pointed out a really key difference: fixed costs versus variable costs.
Fixed costs. Those are the ones that are hard to change quickly, right? Like your mortgage payment or maybe a car loan.
Right. Usually set amounts, often contractual. Variable costs, though, those are the ones that fluctuate. Things like clothes, entertainment, maybe that second streaming service you signed up for, impulse buys.
Oh, okay.
And the insight here is that when spending feels out of control, you almost always find the main culprit and also the quickest path to making cuts in those variable costs.
Because you have direct control over them day to day. Like you can't change your mortgage this month, probably, but you can choose not to buy that extra gadget or eat out quite so much.
Precisely.
And speaking of direct control, the advisor gave them some pretty blunt advice about their credit cards, didn't they?
They really did. The advice was stark. Throw away at least half of them.
Just get rid of them. Cut them up.
Yes. Seriously, if spending is genuinely out of control, the easy physical access to credit just becomes a massive trigger. It enables the behavior. So limiting the means of spending is a necessary step for some people, even if it's, difficult.
That makes sense. It connects right back to that feeling of being out of control. If you're not in control, you need to build some guardrails.
Exactly. Guardrails.
And Understanding all this stuff requires having a common language. We've used some key terms already. Maybe we should just quickly make sure we're clear on them because they really are fundamental to budgeting. We mentioned household income.
Right. Super important. That's the combined income of everyone earning money who lives in that household. It's not just one person's salary.
Okay.
The source used a good example. If one person earns $10,000 and their partner earns $10,000 and they live together, that's a $20,000 household income. It's the total pot of money the household has coming in each month or year, whatever period you're looking at.
Total money coming into the house.
Got it.
We also mentioned allowances for the Carnwell kids and paying their credit cards. What exactly is an allowance technically?
An allowance is basically money given out regularly, usually without requiring specific work in direct exchange for that specific payment.
Okay.
The most common example is, parents giving kids money weekly or monthly. But the source pointed out it applies elsewhere too. Maybe one spouse gets an allowance for personal spending, or a company gives you a travel or food allowance on a business trip. It's money provided for spending, separate from earning it directly through a task right then and there.
Interesting. So it's not exactly the same as chore money, though maybe doing chores is expected generally to get it?
Could be, yeah. The definition is more about the regular giving without a direct task for payment link each time.
Okay. And the trigger for the Carnwells seeking help was the economic downturn affecting the husband's business. What does that phrase really mean in simple terms?
An economic downturn is just a negative phase for the wider economy. Things slow down or get worse. Businesses might struggle, which can unfortunately lead to job losses or, like in this case, reduced income for people. It's basically the opposite of an economic boom when everything's growing.
Right.
For the Carnwells, it meant their income stream, which they had kind of taken for granted, suddenly became less predictable. And that immediately threw their spending problem into sharp relief.
Made it impossible to ignore. Which brings us back to that really crucial concept you mentioned earlier. Allocate or allocate spending.
Yes. To allocate spending means deciding where your money is going to go before you actually spend it.
Okay, so it's proactive.
Exactly. It's about consciously distributing your funds, putting them into different categories based on your budget, your plan. The source mentioned examples like allocating a certain percentage to the kids' allowances, another chunk for the mortgage, setting aside money specifically for potential car repairs. It's the active decision-making that hopefully replaces just letting money flow out passively.
Right. So let's recap the process then. You figure out your cash flow, money in, money out. You track your expenditures, those expenses, to see where it's been going.
That's effective work.
And you allocate it, deciding where it will go in the future.
Yeah.
Focusing especially on trimming those variable costs.
You got it.
And that's essentially how you tackle spending that has, skyrocketed and feels totally out of control. It all kind of links together.
Exactly. And vocabulary isn't just, jargon for accountants. It's the language you use to actually identify the problem areas and then define the solutions. Understanding these terms allocate, expenditure, household income, it helps you frame the challenge and the steps you need to take.
Yeah. Gives you the tools to talk about it, even just to yourself.
Precisely.
Now, thinking about spending habits and why some people maybe struggle with budgeting or trimming those variable costs, the source also shared some interesting personal stories about childhood allowances that really seemed relevant.
Yeah, they did. One person shared growing up with an allowance that started pretty small, like $5 or $6 a week, and then later it went up to maybe $10 or $11.
Okay.
But the crucial part was they had to budget that money if they wanted to, say, go out with friends. Back then, apparently $10 might just cover a movie ticket and a slice of pizza.
Right. Learning to make choices with limited funds.
Exactly. And they also mentioned starting work at 15, which added another layer of understanding about earning and managing money.
So real practical, hands-on budgeting from a young age. The other story offered a bit of a contrast, didn't it?
It did, yeah. In that person's experience, the parents would often just sort of hand over $30 or more whenever they needed money to go out. Or sometimes they had to do specific chores, like washing the car, on top of maybe a smaller base allowance to get extra funds. A bit less structured, perhaps.
Different approaches, for sure. They both kind of offer insights into how we learn about money, or maybe how we don't learn effectively sometimes.
Absolutely. These experiences that seem small at the time, like getting an allowance and how it was handled, or maybe just being given cash when you asked, they can be really foundational. They provide that early practice or lack of practice in learning how to budget, how to allocate, understanding the link between effort and reward, earning and spending. It really can lay down habits, good or bad, that carry right into adulthood. And that might contribute to later struggles with money management for some, or give others a head start on understanding these concepts like cash flow and allocation we've been talking about.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? How those early lessons, or maybe the absence of them, might play into why someone's spending feels out of control years later.
It really does. It kind of raises that question of how much of our current financial behavior is, rooted in those implicit lessons from when we were kids.
Okay, so to sort of wrap up this deep dive on getting a handle on spending, we've seen how essential it is to start with the basics, your cash flow, money in versus money out.
Yep, that's number one. Then doing that sometimes painful but totally necessary work of tracking your expenditures, seeing exactly where the money has gone.
Right. And making that key distinction between the fixed costs, the ones hard to change immediately, and those variable costs, which is where the real power to trim often lies.
That's where the quick wins usually are, yeah. And also facing potentially hard truths like whether limiting access to easy credit is actually needed if spending has genuinely skyrocketed and feels out of control.
And understanding the language really helps you gain control. Terms like household income, allocate, expenditure, they're not just words. They're tools for defining the problem and figuring out the solution.
Couldn't agree more. They empower you.
Ultimately, it seems the power lies in knowledge and making conscious decisions, regardless of your income level or how you ended up in this situation. Understanding exactly where your money is going, those expenditures, that seems to be the absolute critical first step to taking back control.
It really is. So maybe something for you listening to consider is this. How might your own history with money, maybe going way back to getting an allowance or not getting one, have shaped how you spend today?
That's a great question.
And, building on that idea of tackling variable costs, what's maybe one small specific expenditure you could identify this week? Something you could potentially trim just to start flexing that muscle of taking conscious control.